The Celtics are NBA champions.
So the playoffs have come to a conclusion. We're at the end of the finals, and the Boston Celtics are the last team standing. It pains me to say this, but shout out to the Boston Celtics. Congratulations to them for raising banner number 18 as they go on to defeat the Dallas Mavericks in Game 5, 106-88. And not only was Boston the best team in this series, but by all the metrics, all the statistics, and even just looking at how much talent was on the roster, you can easily say that the Boston Celtics were also the best team that the NBA had provided us all season long as well. From start to finish, Boston was dominant, 64 wins, top 3 in both offense and defense. Offensively, specifically, they were not just the number 1 team, but number 1 by a fairly wide margin in contrast to what the league average was. And even if you were someone who had a lot of qualms and hesitation about Jason Tatum and Jaylen Brown, like I stated before the series even began, I personally believe that it didn't really matter because the Boston Celtics were just so talented, had so many different ways to beat a team with the additions of Drew Holiday and Porzingis, and effectively what they provided on both sides of the floor added a level of layering and defensive prowess that not only matched up well with Dallas, but also once more didn't overly depend on what Tatum or Brown brought to the table on a game-to-game basis. And essentially, that's how they won this series. Just go back every single game and you can clearly see on every single night, even if Tatum or Brown did not live up to certain expectations, there was always someone else on the team that was willing to step up to kind of help out wherever they were lacking. Game 1 was the Porzingis game where he came out, had 18 points in the first half along with 2 blocks, made an impact on both sides of the floor. That was a difference maker in a game in which Jason Tatum was struggling from the field. And then you have Game 2 where Tatum didn't have the greatest shooting night and decided to pick up more of a passing and playmaking role. And even though, yes, Jaylen Brown did finish his game scoring 21 points, 7 assists, and shot 53% from the field, his 6 turnovers were really detrimental to what this team was trying to accomplish. But it didn't really matter how bad Tatum shot from the field and how many turnovers Brown may have had because Drew Holiday stepped up big time, scoring 26 points, 11 rebounds, and 3 assists. Then in Game 3, this was definitely a game where Brown and Tatum kind of shared a lot of the responsibilities. Without Kristaps Porzingis, they needed someone to step up huge. Jason Tatum did so immensely in the first 3 quarters, where I believe by far he was the best player on the team. By the end of the first half, Tatum had 20 points in Game 3. To go along with those 20 points, he had 4 rebounds, 2 assists, and shot respectable from the field and from behind the arc. Carried a lot of that production over into the third quarter as well, where he finished the first 3 quarters scoring 27 points and again on very respectable shooting splits. But at the end of the game, where Tatum was effectively almost shooting them out of a 20-point lead, Jaylen Brown stepped up down the stretch of the game and in that fourth quarter scored 9 points, 4 for 7 from the field, and was making timely buckets when necessary to kind of keep them away from completely blowing, again, a 20-point lead that they had gained. Game 4 doesn't really matter. It was a blowout. Neither one of them played really well. But even tonight, I personally believe that Jason Tatum was the best player tonight. He went out there, scored 31 points, 11 assists, 8 rebounds, 2 steals. And even though the shooting splits aren't the greatest, a lot of the damage that he did was in the first half. And by the end of that first half, it was already blown out when the Celtics were already up by 20 points. And in that first half, Tatum had 16 points, 9 assists, and 4 rebounds tonight, shooting splits of 54, 33, and 100. So again, as I predicted, Tatum did not necessarily have to perform at heights in which translated to him being an all-time great performer. Didn't even have to translate to him being a top 5 player in the NBA or heck, even top 10. He had enough pieces around him that would make up for whatever he was lacking, and that happened so much so that Jaylen Brown ended up winning Finals MVP in the process as well. Again, Drew Holiday and Kristaps Porzingis, 2 off-season additions that made massive difference makers throughout this series. And I say all this to say, not to poo-poo on Tatum, but I say all this to say that the Celtics, I personally believe the biggest winner out of all of this has to be that front office and the decision makers, especially Brad Stevens, and what they've brought to this roster over the past handful of seasons as they have become ahead of charge post Danny Ainge. I do believe that one of the biggest things that a lot of people, and I do mean a lot of people, struggle with is comprehending players' strengths and weaknesses and trying to build a roster accordingly. Effectively, what ends up happening is that there's a bunch of organizations that know, and identify that some of their players are either incomplete or not well-rounded in certain areas, but they just assume that they're going to be so great in their strengths that their weaknesses do not matter. But the one thing I'm noticing today's game, especially post-super team era, post the Warriors and the Cavaliers consistently going back-to-back to the NBA Finals, and that is players in today's game, even the best players, are so heavily flawed in certain aspects of the game of basketball that you either A, have to acknowledge this and try to build a roster around it, or B, have to become victim to teams just completely picking apart of your weaknesses every single time. But I do believe, on the other hand, the one thing I really appreciate from Boston and their ability to kind of build a team over the past couple of years is that they acknowledge Jason Tatum and Jaylen Brown's deficiencies, things that they lack in, and instead of just forcing them to be players that they probably will never be, they went out there, they improved their roster. We're going to need an upgrade from Marcus Smart, even though it may kill them. And I'm pretty sure there's a lot of Celtics fans that hate that Marcus Smart is not a part of this process because it does suck. But nevertheless, as good as Marcus Smart was, as much as he may have been the heart and soul of this team, at the end of the day, an upgrade was necessary because Jason Tatum and Jaylen Brown were not good enough to usurp whatever he may have been lacking. And that's where you get Drew Holiday. And Holiday specifically in the finals had multiple moments and games that were necessary for them to win in 5. And yes, I do mean necessary because I do not believe that Marcus Smart would have been as good as a defender on Kyrie Irving. And he's a great defender, but I don't believe that his versatility lends itself to do the same things that Drew Holiday was able to do. And I definitely don't believe that Marcus Smart would have had outings like we saw from Drew Holiday, I believe in game 2 or game 3, where he had 26 points. Same thing with Porzingis. Rob and Grant Williams were great pieces to this team in the years prior. They added a level of versatility defensively that was really hard to find in the NBA. Grant Williams was adding to his three-point shot to be a kind of sort of floor spacer. But at the end of the day, with Rob Williams consistently not being available and Grant Williams being significantly limited on what he can do offensively, it was very, very clear that this team still needed some type of impact player in the front court that added a level of dynamic play offensively while still retaining a lot of their defensive abilities and keeping that identity on that side of the floor. And Porzingis fit that to the T. And so the point that I'm making is, again, heading into this series, I felt very, very confident in the idea that Boston was going to win just solely based off of the fact that they can beat you in several different ways. And even though people were hesitant and critical and going to continue to be critical of Jason Tatum, I personally believe it was an out for people to not acknowledge how well-rounded the team was as a whole. And even the improvements from Jason Tatum also as well, because the one thing that really does bother me about the conversation that I know a lot of people are going to have in the next upcoming days, even though, again, I don't think that Jason Tatum had the greatest series, there are still things that Jason Tatum improved in his game, especially his passing, his playmaking, his decision-making. 2 or 3 of these games where he was able to do things that I just genuinely do not believe he had the capacity of doing 2 years ago, right? Yes, there's a lot of things that Tatum struggled with. There's a lot of things that Tatum still lacks in. But also, even with him lacking in those regards, the front office, the decision makers, the brain trust out in Boston, they identified that. They knew that was the case. And they went out and made much needed improvements to a roster that now has led them to, again, not only 64 wins, not only one of the best statistical profiles that we've seen over the past 40 years, not only a postseason run that resulted in only 3 losses, but more importantly, a championship. And I do believe that those improvements turned out to be the difference maker for a team that still was going to have problems with Tatum and Brown's inabilities all series long, especially going up against certain matchups. And I honestly believe the only team that would have really given them a problem from a matchup perspective while being able to keep up with them was Denver, because Denver has Jokic, and I think Jokic would have really provided a lot of problems with what they were trying to do defensively. Nevertheless, this is still a team that is really, really great from top to bottom. Great season, great run, and effectively they were able to compromise and slow down an offense that a lot of teams struggled with in the Western Conference just solely because they matched up with them really, really well. The brilliance behind Drew Holiday as an individual defender is something that I always marvel at. I think that he is one of the greatest on-ball defenders the league has ever seen. And yes, I'm going to stick by my take that I think that he is a better on-ball defender than Gary Payton. His ability to stick on someone, be switchable, versatile, defend multiple positions, tag bigs. Like, I just think that Drew Holiday provides something that is really, really, really hard to match. He is that special of a defender. And then you have Jason Tatum and Jaylen Brown. A lot of people want to talk about what they did offensively, but in my opinion, on the defensive side of the floor is where a lot of their value was, and it made up for whatever they may have been lacking on the offensive side of the floor, because how aggressive Jaylen Brown was as the initial defender on Luka Doncic advantage, that really did change the complexion of this series. And he was by far the best defender I've seen on Luka all postseason long. But moreover, had the personnel also to really negate and cut out a lot of the switching that Luka hunts for and takes advantage of, because you can put a Jason Tatum on a Daniel Gafford. You can put a Jason Tatum on a Derek Lively. And so now all of those lob threats are being cut out completely, because when Lively or Gafford comes and set the screen, they're immediately switching Jaylen Brown to Jason Tatum, and you go from one competent, lengthy, strong perimeter defender to another competent, lengthy, strong perimeter defender. And it really negated a lot of the rotation that Luka thrives in to not only get himself quality looks, but also give his teammates quality looks as well. Shout out to Joe Mazzulla, youngest, I think he's the youngest coach in NBA history to win a championship, only 35 years old, which is crazy. Like, he's only like a handful of years older than me. That's kind of crazy. God, I need to get my life together. Holy hell. He basically employed a defensive scheme that I honestly thought that Minnesota should have employed, and that is putting his bigs on the corner three-point shooters in PJ Washington and Derrick Jones Jr. So it effectively not only cuts out a lot of that switching that normally would occur when the big comes up and sets the screen, but when PJ Washington and when Derrick Jones Jr. did come up to set the screen as they were trying to bait a switch and kind of hunt Al Horford or Porzingis, you would immediately double team Luka or double team Kyrie Irving. You would basically force Derrick Jones Jr. and PJ Washington to float out to the top of the key and take shots that they're not comfortable with whatsoever. And effectively, we're just being honest with ourselves, there really wasn't that much nuance behind this series beyond that type of a defensive scheme, because Dallas doesn't have that many different ways to win ball games. What they do best is what they're going to continue to do, and that is really, in my opinion, overly depend on the excellence of the shot creation from Luka Doncic and Kyrie Irving. Like, that's really the only way. But again, shout out to the Boston Celtics. What they did this year was fantastic. It was great. Now, before I go deep into what I saw from Dallas' series, and before I become probably a bit too critical of some of these players in Dallas, especially their playing style, I want to congratulate Dallas. I want to congratulate the Mavericks. They just got done with a run that I don't think anyone really expected for them to pull off outside of Nick Wright and Mavericks fans. A lot of people, including myself, thought that the Denver Nuggets were going to make an appearance in the NBA Finals. You still got to give credit where credit is due. Luka, Kyrie were sensational. I think the defensive scheme from what we saw from Dallas, especially in the conference finals, was amazing. Derrick Jones Jr., PJ Washington, Daniel Gafford, and Derek Lively had great, and I do mean great moments. But going up against the Boston Celtics, it was just going to be a really, really tough task to ask these players to kind of get together and beat a team that was just noticeably better than them. I know what I'm about to say next. It may come across as really, really harsh, but I do want to just at least give the congratulations where it's due. So you tip your cap off to them and what they were able to accomplish this postseason run. Hopefully they'll be back better than ever. Now going into the NBA Finals. I still have a hard time being overly critical, but in the same instance, I feel like it's necessary because of the conversations and talks that were permeating before we got to the finals. And I try, and I really do, I try my hardest not to allow what other people may think in their thoughts around certain players dictate how I make videos and my opinions on certain players. But I have to just say, I thought that it was very disingenuous the way that some people were talking about a backcourt of Luka and Kyrie in contrast to not just the Boston Celtics as a team, because I saw some people claiming that the Mavericks are going to have not just the best, but also the second best player on their team in this series, implying that Kyrie Irving is better than both Jaylen Brown and Jason Tatum, which is crazy to me. But people were going as far as to say that Luka Doncic and Kyrie Irving is the best backcourt of all time. And on the surface, I understand where we got to that point because, again, Kyrie and what he was doing in that Minnesota Timberwolves series, amazing. Like, what he was doing against the Wolves was crazy, and that was something I was not expected. And I do believe that Kyrie, because of that series, improved and exceeded expectations so much so that it may have warranted some of the ridiculous claims that people were making. But I also believe that people need to pump their brakes and be a bit more realistic with some of the praise that they hand out to certain players, especially when you're going up against a team that is meant to match up well with you. Bro, to expect that the Dallas Mavericks were going to beat the Boston Celtics, I don't know if it was a sense of degrading Boston. I don't know if it was a sense of not understanding how well-rounded the Celtics were, or if it was just this level of just dick sucking for the Dallas Mavericks that I have really almost never seen anybody in the media jump that quickly on a duo in my lifetime, especially a duo that had never accomplished anything. Stephen A. Smith made an argument that I'm gauging my top 10 backcourt list or top 5 backcourt list because of championships and accomplishments. But then you put Luka and Kyrie at like 3 or 4. I'm like, God damn, like what? That don't even make no damn sense. And be very mindful, when you make these type of allegations or these predictions, effectively what you mean is that you have so much faith in Kyrie Irving and Luka Doncic to outperform the better team that you would only have to assume that those two would perform at heights that could rival all-time great duos. And you would effectively need to assume that Luka and Kyrie would have to have a Shaq and Kobe-esque type of series against the Celtics. That's what you would have to assume. And unfortunately, that's not what happened. And it's the reason why we really should just pump the brakes, because the numbers this series, especially from Kyrie, was just egregiously bad. So Luka finishes the series averaging 29 points, 9 rebounds, 5.5 assists, shooting splits of 47, 24, and 58. And what really tanked Luka's efficiency was his three-point shooting. 24% from three, completely unacceptable. Further context, in the last 3 games of this series, Luka shot basically 12% from three. There was a stretch where Luka went 1 for 21 from three. Luka made a three-pointer in the first quarter of game 3, then proceeded not to make another three-pointer until the fourth quarter of game 5. Luka did address some concerns of people trying to highlight his injury in the post-game interview of game 5. He said, hey, I'm out there, I'm available, I'm playing, so I just got to be better. And I think that's the right way to address it. But just looking at how Luka performed, he just wasn't the same player he was in the beginning of this postseason run. He certainly wasn't the same player he was in the regular season. There were several times where he was getting switched on to Sam Hauser, Al Horford, and Kristaps Porzingis, and he was settling for threes. He was settling for step backs. He wasn't getting by them and getting to the rim, which in my opinion was supposed to be effectively the biggest advantage creator amongst everyone in this series when he got those matchups in favor for him. But he was just settling for a lot of jump shots, and it just felt like he was a step slower because he couldn't gain any type of separation amongst any of those players whatsoever. And I think that level of poor performance, especially from behind the arc, did play a difference maker on what they were or were not able to do. Also defensively, I do love the fact that Luka in the last 2 games gave a much better effort defensively than he did in game 3. And I do love the fact that he responded in that manner, because I believe there was way too many people trying to give him excuses to why he wasn't performing well enough in game 3 defensively. From the beginning of the game to the end of the game, he's just not paying attention. There's a lot of things that have little to do with effort rather than just attention to detail, and he's still lacking that. So I don't really think it had a lot to do with like what he could do physically. He just didn't give a damn, and I think that was a major problem, like a really, really major problem. Even if Luka performed well, I don't really think it would have been enough, because I mean, effectively, the way that, again, they were defending him, it wasn't just the fact that they were closing off what he was doing offensively as a scorer, but also really reducing what he could do offensively as a passer and playmaker as well. When you have an offense that is catered in a heliocentric manner, it's really hard to beat a team that can beat you in several different ways, because you only have one way to win basketball games. And this kind of goes back to answering the age-old question, can you win basketball games at a high level consistently enough, playing this style of basketball, in large part because of the players that you would normally need to keep around him to kind of maximize him as a role player standpoint, who effectively are basically just being asked to do 1 or 2 things offensively. And then outside of that, they can't do nothing else. If Derrick Jones Jr. and PJ Washington are not knocking down corner threes or getting to the basket, they are useless. They are pointless. There's nothing else that they can do. I think there's a huge reason why Jason Kidd opted in the idea of pulling Derrick Jones Jr. out of the rotation for like 2 of the last 3 games and experimenting with Tim Hardaway Jr., experimenting with Dante Exum. I think he knew that he needed a little bit more dynamic effect offensively from another guard on the team that Derrick Jones Jr. was just never going to be able to provide. And again, I want to be clear, I don't think that's a Derrick Jones Jr. problem. Like, he is who he is. He's a player that has limitations. He's a role player. Asking him to do more than what he's been asked to do all season long, that is the limitations and the restrictions and the weaknesses behind running a heliocentric offense, those players are never going to be asked nor get the reps to improve themselves in any other capacity outside of just being corner three-point shooters and finishing at the basket. Same with Derek Lively and Daniel Gafford. They're never going to be post players. They're not going to have a face-up game. They're still never going to be asked to do anything else outside of set a screen, roll hard to the basket, and then get it off the glass offensively. That's really it. They lost a lot of these games by such a wide margin that Luka still would have needed somebody else to come along the ride. And it wasn't going to be an extra corner 3 here and there from Derrick Jones Jr. or PJ Washington, or a few extra lobs from Derek Lively or Daniel Gafford. It was going to have to be from Kyrie Irving. And so now you're asking Kyrie to be a player that, respectfully to Kyrie, he just hasn't been in quite some time, especially against this Boston Celtics roster. Kyrie Irving finishing this series being held to 20 points, 3 rebounds, 5 assists, 2 turnovers, 41% from the field, 28% from behind the arc, and 100% from the charity stripe. Don't get lost in the sauce with that free throw percentage shooting, because because he only attempted 9 free throws in a 5-game sample size, which is egregious, and that all resulted in a true shooting percentage of 48%. Heading up against Boston, in the last 15 attempts, Kyrie is 1 for 14 against Boston. That's crazy. And just looking at the numbers dating back to the 2022 campaign, the numbers have been fairly consistent, the shooting splits have been fairly consistent, and the problems and concerns have all been, again, fairly consistent over a 15-game sample size. And within these 15 games, Kyrie's averaging 20 points, 4 rebounds, 5 assists, shooting splits of 42, 29, and 97.5. Please do not get caught up in that free throw percentage because he's only attempting around 2 to 3 free throws a game and has a true shooting percentage of 50%. Effectively, who Kyrie was in this series is who he has been against the Boston Celtics dating back to 2022. And we can all argue and discuss and debate back and forth on why that is. I think Kyrie kind of alluded to the idea of like mentally he has a lot more that is still clinging onto his relationship with Boston when he was there for a short-lived period of time, and how some of those demons he may not have let go completely, and that's understandable. Running with that narrative allows people to escape the reality of who Kyrie Irving is, especially against a team that just defensively matches up well with him. I don't understand like how you can have any more evidence than what you're looking at and what you've been provided for when it comes to Kyrie against Boston, who has a lot of length, a lot of athleticism, players that can really keep up with him when he starts to shift because Kyrie isn't as quick as he once was. People putting that aside and believing that they're going to get something not just better, but so much better that it would have made up for whatever else this team may have been lacking in terms of their offensive creativeness that wouldn't supersede or go beyond what Luka or Kyrie would have been able to provide. To me, it's crazy. Kyrie, healthy, went into this series, knew what was everyone knew was going to get into, and I think that people thought Kyrie was somebody that he was not. It's the reason why many people decided to lean more towards Dallas than Boston, and just believing that Kyrie was going to be a part of a run that could have upset it. Literally, it would have been the biggest upset that we would have probably ever seen in the last 40 years. I know people are going to talk about the Golden State Warriors blowing the 3-1 lead. That certainly would have been in the conversation. But the fact that Tatum and Brown and really everyone else not named Porzingis would have went into the series healthy, you could easily argue that this would have been the biggest upset in the last 40 years. I think that's crazy. I think that was fool's gold. And I think the people who do that to Kyrie, who pedestalize him and who puts him in conversations that he doesn't belong, I not only think you do him a disservice, but I also believe you all do a lot of other players in the NBA a disservice, because there's just a lot of things that Kyrie lacks in terms of like a creator, especially because he's just not as athletic and strong and talented and physically gifted as a lot of other people. So him being able to pull off a great series against a team that, again, that just matches up well with him, bro, he would have to literally, and I do mean literally, go to a space that I don't think he has been in since he's played with LeBron. Again, Kyrie's amazing. My gripe isn't necessarily with him, but more so around the conversation that people have with him. All the skill, who love to push this dribble headsy tween bullshit. And I'm not saying that having skill isn't necessary, but I do believe that the dialogue and conversation needs to be a bit more developed than just sitting here saying that Kyrie is so skilled that he's going to just perform at levels that is going to rival all-time great guards against a team that defensively is set to defend him to a T, and they've been doing it for the last 2 to 3 years now. I understand that people had to say their apologies. I was one of them, but I wasn't about to jump out the window and say Kyrie's better than Jason Tatum. I'm not about to say that. I'm not going to sit here and say Kyrie's the most skilled player of all time. I'm not about to say that either. I'm just not going to. Regardless, shout out to Dallas. Great run. They need to add a lot more, and I do mean a lot more offensive firepower to their team while still keeping a lot of their defensive identity. Derek Lively's going to come back and be better. I think Daniel Gafford's going to come back and be better. But realistically speaking, Derek Jones Jr. is a bench player that was put in the starting lineup because they didn't really have any other options, especially because Tim Hardaway Jr. fell off the face of the earth in terms of production. So they need to make a bit more improvements. This is where the Paul George conversation comes in. Maybe even the Klay Thompson conversation comes in as well. Hopefully they can potentially make some moves and some changes to the roster that will put them in a better position. Kyrie Irving, next year's the last year of his deal. Tim Hardaway, same, last year of his deal. You can kind of move Tim for as an expiring contract and probably get some other pieces, bring them in. Also, Maxi Kleber, I think where he's at in his point in his career, career also is probably going to get moved, and effectively that'll be $27 million being moved over the offseason, and you can maybe get something out of that, especially depending on what Paul George wants to do. I think that is a bit interesting move if PG wants to play as the wing that is being spoon-fed quality looks that I do believe best maximize who he is as a player. Outside of that, again, shout out to Dallas, shout out to the Mavericks. What they did was amazing. It was sensational. It was great. Great run, great season. Exceeded my expectations. You know, nothing but respect for them. But hey, those are my thoughts. Please let me know yours in the comment section below. The next video will be me talking about Finals MVP and the concept of being the best player on the best team. So make sure you hit the subscribe button, notification bell, so you can be updated when I upload that video on this channel. But until next time, I'll see you all later. Peace.